First of all, thank you both for getting on the Zoom.
Yeah, sure.
These producers have asked us to investigate the origins of COVID, to go and hunt down Dr. Anthony Fauci and ask him a bunch of tough questions.
Gotcha.
And if we get anything wrong, I'm going to be committing career suicide as a director, and I'll probably never work again.
Even if you get everything right, people are going to hate you for this documentary.
It doesn't scare me to enter this conversation if it's dangerous. I do need your help to get the research right. So that's really the job, and it starts tonight because
sure.
I have to go to DC in a couple days.
I'm just going to jump right in. Let's look at this clip, right? Remember when Fauci went on Face the Nation that time?
Yeah.
They're really criticizing science.
He's repeatedly said
because I represent science.
He is the science. People who've been tracking this story believe that he does represent science. Everything wrong with science.
But the thing is that everything about the pandemic has been so shit-coded and politicized from the very beginnings.
Yeah.
Fauci does not love you, I guarantee it.
It's not popular opinion. This is not mainstream thought.
This is not broadcast by the mainstream news media because...
Have you seen the COVID misinformation page?
It's crazy, man.
Yeah, why don't we go there right now? Let's go through this page and figure out what has nothing to do with Anthony Fauci. We've got meteor origin, that a meteor carried the pandemic.
Wow, man.
Like deep impact?
We've got drinking cow urine and applying cow dung to your body can cure COVID.
And
nothing to do with Fauci. May be interesting to try.
I guess I'll try anything once.
I'm okay, man.
Now we're getting closer. Washing groceries in Purell.
Oranges in the sink.
He didn't say to do
Don't
it,
forget to disinfect your trunk.
Yeah.
but he also didn't say not to do it.
People should not be walking around with masks.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites.
And loosely related to Fauci, you've got 5G.
I'm a guinea pig.
You've got the whole pandemic scandal.
Mickey Willer.
Fauci and Bill Gates. QAnon. We've got whatever Fox News said about Fauci.
It's like a Rorschach test.
Thing they show serial killers and kindergartners.
We will not comply.
Thank you, and keep the faith.
Wow.
How do you not be cynical in this world, man?
Okay, right here at the top, directly related to Fauci, the consensus among virologists is that the most likely origin is natural crossover from animals.
Right. Feel sorry for bats, man. They get a bad rap.
Coronavirus jumps from an animal to a human,
Maybe,
probably in a wet market.
maybe not.
Where they
Did it come from a lab? Isn't that what we want to know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally consistent with a jump of the species from an animal to a human.
Right. This is just nature.
I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now, but...
Okay, Wikipedia says the resurgence of the lab leak and other theories was fueled in part by the publication in May 2021 of early emails with Fauci.
There were like thousands of emails, documents, grant proposals.
Who knows what else?
Honestly, I have no idea, but I should tell you guys that right after the pandemic, I got approached to direct a movie about Fauci.
Wow.
It was not about COVID. It was about AIDS in Africa and how he saved a lot of lives. And I have his contact. So I'm thinking that I'd just start writing him an email. Here are the movies I worked on. I was supposed to do one about you, but you did one for Nat Geo and for PBS and not mine. And now I'm looking at this COVID thing, and there seems to be a lot of controversy.
You do not know what you are talking about.
All the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
So according to Rand Paul, Anthony Fauci is Frankenstein from the 1931 movie.
It's alive! What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on.
We gotta ask him to explain gain-of-function research.
Where you're looking at a deadly pathogen and you're figuring out what could make it more deadly. There was a tremendous controversy.
It's biological warfare.
Is it biowarfare? Is it biodefense? Whatever it is, it was dangerous.
Why were we doing it in the first place?
Did you help the US government spy on China?
Are you responsible for killing millions of people?
Actually, a serious question. Did you do it? Are you a sociopath?
Yeah, you probably shouldn't write any of that.
So what am I gonna sign it? Like,
How about thank you, Dr. Fauci?
Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you for your years of service.
Right, I'm sure he loves to hear that.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
All right. I sent it.
Nice.
I mean, I think there's about a 10% chance that he's going to write me back, so let's see what happens.
You've reached out to Dr. Fauci. This is not a hit piece. This is not a hit piece.
But it's tricky, like everyone's gonna have an opinion.
You won't get the disease, but you can carry the disease and you can spread it, you dumb fuck. You're a dumb fuck, you're not listening. You're a dumb fuck, you're not listening. You're a dumb fuck.
Yeah.
Just because you've been
I don't think people understand how stressful this job is.
This could potentially be one of the biggest stories of our time.
And I hope that you never have to go through COVID because it is evil.
20 million people may be dead. There could be up to $25 trillion in damages. And if this could have been prevented, I mean, the whole world has a right to know.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for doing all you can to keep America healthy.
I mean, look at all these celebrities.
You are America's scientist.
They worship this guy.
Anthony Fauci's work has saved literally millions of lives.
We are breaking down this concept of idolatry.
Yeah, I mean, it's dangerous when something as big as science can be falsely represented by one man.
In the end, very few people have firsthand experience working with him. And almost none of those people will talk to you.
I was told I need to talk to Dr. Robert Redfield. He was the director of the CDC at the time of the pandemic.
He's the highest placed person who's been outspoken on Fauci.
Patient has had long COVID since 2020.
His whole career got turned upside down from the pandemic, and now he's back practicing as a doctor and specializes in long COVID.
Currently being treated with antihistamine. My own view is that this virus was not of natural origin. It was an act of scientific arrogance.
He's blamed in the early days for a lot of the problems with the pandemic. But then there's other reports that say that he told Fauci that this was most likely a lab leak, and he was excluded from all these secret teleconferences that were happening.
He's also a colleague of Fauci's for 40 years. It's incredible.
And then in 2018, they get put in the same orbit again when Redfield gets appointed to be the director of the CDC.
One of the reasons I accepted the CDC job is that I have 12 grandchildren, and I just have a very strong premonition that our nation is going to have a terrible, terrible pandemic. New Year's Eve, 2019. I got a phone call from my team in China, and I was informed that there was 27 cases of an unspecified pneumonia. From the beginning, my antennas were up. I called my counterpart, George Gao, who was the head of the CDC in China, and he said, it came from the wet market. And viruses go from animals to humans. When you look at SARS, it went from a bat to a civet cat to humans. MERS came from a bat to a camel to humans. It takes them a long time to learn how to transmit effectively in the human species. And this virus immediately understood how to replicate effectively in humans. It was clear from the information I was getting that there were literally thousands of patients, if not more, and getting some intelligence feedback that this was a major issue. Everyone, without any critical analysis, attributed this to the wet market. And nobody went back and looked at people that had nothing to do with the wet market. And a couple days later, George Gao called me back and he said, Bob, we have hundreds of cases and it has nothing to do with the wet market. So we knew by the first couple days in January that this wet market story, in my view, was a ruse. I called the National Security Council and I told them that there was a situation in China, and then I called Anthony Fauci. And I told him, as a clinical virologist, this virus was way too infectious in humans right out of the gate. I felt strongly that it had been educated in the laboratory.
And Redfield knew that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the most famous lab in the world for researching coronaviruses. So the idea that this virus came from a lab is very reasonable.
We were talking about it, and Tony argues that my premise is wrong, that I believed it came from the lab, and it was clear the aggressive support for the wet market being the source. I thought that Tony should embrace scientific investigation, but Tony only considered a single hypothesis. It was spillover, 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 spillover. I was perplexed.
Redfield thought this virus could have been the product of gain-of-function research, which is genetically mutating viruses to make them more infectious and deadly. Fauci had been a champion of this type of research for decades.
For gain-of-function research, I mean, Tony is the poster boy. He believed the best way to prepare for the next pandemic is to predict it by creating it. If we can create the pathogen that can negatively impact humanity, then we can prevent it. But this is a big difference between Fauci and me, because I disagree with that logic. I think we should not be doing this gain-of-function research. We don't have the proper biocontainment in these labs, and that could cause a laboratory leak or accident. So it's very dangerous. Of course, Tony argued this was science. I've known and worked with Tony since 1981. Tony believed that science is supreme, and the more you do of science, the higher up the mountain you go. You know, Oppenheimer learned the hard way that there's some downside to science. Right? He learned the hard way. Tony doesn't see the downside to science, and that is a big problem.
It's interesting because it has jumped species likely from an animal source into the human.
If you go back, Tony's got a lot of airtime on tape.
Viruses emerge from animal reservoirs.
He was very aggressive in saying that this had to be natural spillover.
Probably in a wet market.
The White House Coronavirus Task Force stood up somewhere, I think in late January. We did invite Fauci to be part of it. Tony made it very clear that it was spillover, 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 spillover. We obviously disagreed on the potential of origin in those meetings, and that's where the lines were drawn. But then I saw the papers that were published by the Wuhan lab. NIAID was acknowledged on the paper in 2014. That was evidence Tony had funded the Wuhan laboratory. And being an insider at the time, I said to myself, I mean, what's going on here? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. I would now like to invite Dr. Anthony Fauci.
I can start off by putting it into perspective by telling you I often get asked, we have an influence.
And when Tony spoke, I was just very shocked at how aggressive he was to try to take the leadership position on being the voice of the pandemic.
The kinds of things we're doing here right now.
I was only the head of CDC, which, by all accounts, was the leading public health position in the United States, until I got iced out. People argued that it was the White House. I don't buy that.
I've just been going through all these different documents. There's a lot of people who have been covering this for years now.
What I understand about Dr. Richard Ebright is that he is, in a sense, probably the most vocal critic of Anthony Fauci.
Richard, is it true that people call you Anthony Fauci's worst nightmare?
Yes.
From what I've read, it seems like he hates Anthony Fauci and Anthony Fauci hates him.
And it's not even just about COVID. It's like been happening for the last 20 years between the two of them.
We have willful, deliberate misfeasance that likely caused a pandemic, killed 20 million, and cost $25 trillion. Against that context, it is unsurprising that individuals would prefer a lie.
Neil Harrison's a scientist at Columbia, and he was tracking COVID since the beginning.
Scientists don't generally like to criticize other scientists, and we really don't like to use the F word.
What's the F word?
Fraud. I said the F word.
And he's now helping a congressional investigation into the origins of COVID and the potential of a cover-up.
Hi, this is Emily Kopp. I'm a reporter with US Right to Know in Washington.
So Emily Kopp is a health reporter, and around 2021, she shifted into covering the origins of COVID.
I felt like I had a moral obligation to get answers.
She's been responsible for a lot of the Freedom of Information documents, and her main focus has been sort of piecing together the behind-the-scenes communications between Fauci and this group of scientists.
So I'm going to go see Charles Rixey. What do I need to know about him?
Rixey, he's part of this group called Drastic, which is this sort of decentralized investigative team comprised of scientists, web sleuths, and veterans.
That's me in the black shirt. I was really sick when I got COVID. And then a former Marine reached out to me and said, you should look into the origin of the virus. And from that date in 2020, I shifted my attention full-time to figuring out what the origin of the virus was.
He believes COVID was engineered in a lab.
On January 11th, the genome of SARS-CoV-2 was released by the Chinese.
This is the genetic sequence of the virus. Molecular biologists can look at these letters and they can compare these sequences to other similar viruses looking for differences. And they immediately found a huge difference.
Some aspects of it looked unnatural.
That section right in the middle, PRRA, that is something that they call a furin cleavage site. And that can have a lot to do with how infectious the virus is in humans. They could not find it in any similar viruses, and that was really suspicious.
The furin cleavage site stands out like a sore thumb.
So this furin cleavage site is right on the spike protein, and this is what makes the virus stick to human cells. So if they were using gain of function and they were modifying a virus in the lab, this is exactly what they would use to make it more infectious.
Every informed person knew at that point that lab engineering was a very real possibility, and discussions began immediately.
So on January 27th, there's another twist. Dr. Fauci is contacted over email by this scientist named Christian Anderson.
Christian Anderson is a virologist based in California who sort of started out as this whistleblower that the virus seemed unusual and might have resulted from a lab accident.
Christian Anderson came to him with a 2015 paper by Zhang Lishi, who works at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
And Anderson says it looks like a how-to manual for creating SARS-CoV-2 in a lab.
This is the paper connected to a scientist at the Wuhan lab. And if we scroll down here, you can see in the funding section, they cite 13 grants. All of those grants are connected to the US and the NIH, National Institute of Health. And 9 of those grants were signed by Anthony Fauci and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. I mean, Redfield saw the same connections weeks prior, and now random scientists like Christian Anderson are finding more of these connections on the internet, and they're directly emailing Fauci about it. And they all agree this furin cleavage site doesn't look natural.
On January 27th, when Christian Anderson emailed him about the furin cleavage site, Fauci says, if this is correct, then you should probably contact the FBI because this could be suspicious. It may be signs of engineering and may even be related to biological weapons research.
I would love to ask him about this email because I don't think it makes that much sense.
Why wouldn't he call the FBI? I mean, this is a guy who's been in government for 40 years, more. Why would he not call the FBI? And then, on January 31st, there's this paper from a group of scientists in India, Pradhan et al. And it points out not just the furin cleavage site, but there are other areas of this spike protein that don't look natural and
could be from HIV.
Wow.
Which is totally fucked up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is frightening.
In addition to the fear and cleavage site, these 3 inserts were suspiciously similar to spike protein of HIV.
At that point in time, Dr. Fauci began an email storm. He emailed other members of the United States government, as well as outside scientists, urgently asking their opinions about laboratory origin.
And a lot of these panicked emails seem to be written to Sir Jeremy Farrar. Farrar is an extremely powerful scientist from the UK, and they seem to be back-channeling about how to handle this story.
Fauci and Jeremy Farrar consulted on how to address the optics, inviting scientists to an emergency teleconference to be held the next day on a Saturday.
You can look at the emails, like not a single email is written to Bob Redfield that night about any of this.
I considered both Jeremy Farrar and Fauci scientific colleagues. We may not go out to dinner every night, but we were scientific colleagues, and I thought there was mutual respect.
Redfield was not part of this February 1st teleconference that took place. It is unthinkable when there's a potential viral pandemic that the director of the CDC would not be part of this initial conversation.
So this emergency teleconference happens right after on Saturday, February 1st. And they have invited Christian Anderson, who had emailed Fauci earlier with his concerns that this may be a lab leak.
Anderson looped in Robert Gary, a Tulane close colleague of Anderson, and Andrew Rambo at the University of Edinburgh, and Eddie Holmes at the University of Sydney, who has worked very closely with the China CDC.
So all these guys are on this Slack. They're saying stuff like the virus became loaded for human transmission, exactly what you would expect from lab engineering.
The call appears to have been a shouting match between Anderson and Holmes, who had these suspicions about unusual aspects of the genome, and the gain-of-function virologists who had spent years saying that their work could not ignite a pandemic. We also know through Slacks that were exchanged during the call that there was some sort of quote-unquote big ask. But we don't know what the big ask was.
We don't know what was discussed on this call. We only have these Slacks. But a big ask was made.
And you look at these Slacks, whatever these dudes were asked to do, Anderson thinks it's hard to pull off.
Farrar, Collins, and Fauci, altogether they oversee about $72 billion in funding every year. So if you're a scientist and perhaps one of these gentlemen ask you to write something, you have an enormous incentive to write something that they will like.
Anderson and Gary had a very large grant proposal for a center of research on emerging infectious diseases in West Africa. That grant proposal was on Fauci's desk. In a very real sense, Christian Anderson and Robert Gary had $8.9 million to comply.
On February 3rd, there's another teleconference with Ralph Barrick and Peter Daszak. Both had received a lot of money from Fauci's agency, and Daszak had been out in the media promoting this and his nonprofit for years.
EcoHealth Alliance, what is it?
Well, we're a non-profit, a typical charity funded by federal government and other sources.
EcoHealth Alliance has an enormous budget from many different US agencies, NIH, Department of Defense.
He does a ton of work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There were a lot of people in the scientific community who felt like Peter Daszak may have known more than he alluded to. I mean, I really wonder, did Anthony Fauci think that too?
The goal of this February 3rd meeting was to combat misinformation related to the origin of COVID-19. That was the stated goal. Immediately after this meeting, Pradhan et al., the first paper to publish the existence of the 3 inserts suspiciously similar to the spike protein of HIV, a paper that was published just 72 hours prior, was withdrawn. under intense pressure.
Gone. Taken off the internet.
Wow.
After the teleconferences, while the virus was spreading around the world and beginning to kill a lot of people,
Death toll from the coronavirus now topping 34,000.
all these scientists that had come together to speak with Fauci and Farrar and Collins, they write a bunch of papers that claim this couldn't have come from a lab and must have come from nature. So was that the big ask?
All the members of that teleconference published 33 articles.
There was a paper that stated that there was no evidence for laboratory engineering. There's a section called Figures and Data, and it's empty. There's no data and there are no figures.
Day after day, week after week, there was a different scientific paper.
It has the quality of a media campaign.
And then there's this one in The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world.
The letter in Lancet's not even a scientific paper. I call it a wedding announcement. It's orchestrated by Jeremy Farrar. It's basically an article saying that anyone who thinks this virus came from a lab is a conspirator. And it's signed by over 20 very prominent scientists.
At the bottom of the letter, it says, "We declare no competing interest."
But Peter Daszak is the guy who writes the letter, so I have no idea what the Lancet is thinking, but that is a competing interest.
And then you have the proximal origin paper.
It was written by those guys from Slack.
And it is arguably the biggest one. The paper gets released and went viral.
It immediately gets something like 3 million views.
But I consider proximal origin very sloppy science.
This was propaganda. This was not science.
Then there's this press conference.
Investigation into whether the virus escaped from this lab in Wuhan. How active is that? And when do you expect
We're looking at it. They talk about a certain kind of bat, but that bat wasn't in that area. If you can believe this, that's what they're down to now is bats. But that bat is not in that area. That bat wasn't so.
And then there's another reporter who asks if this virus could come from a lab. And he directs that question to Anthony Fauci.
Yeah. There was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists.
And this is where it gets really weird, because now Fauci says that there's this paper.
Bats as they evolve and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now.
And he's referring to proximal origin, the paper that was written by those guys from Slack.
Is totally consistent with a jump from an animal to a human. So, I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now, but we can make that available too.
He said that he had just seen a paper that he didn't know much about or who the authors were.
I don't have the authors right now, but we can make that available too.
I think it'd be good to just rewind this for a second and listen to what he says here. Listen to this.
Totally consistent with a jump of a species.
It's not so much what he says, but what he didn't say.
Species from an animal to a human. So, I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now.
He says he doesn't have the authors. Is he saying that because he legitimately is blanking on their names?
Let me have some water.
I know that Fauci is a very busy man, and as he said, he gets hundreds of emails a day. But I find it incredibly hard to believe
highly qualified
that he would not remember the names of people that he spoke to on the eve of the pandemic.
Well, I don't have the authors right now, but
it's not just that he can't remember the names. It sounds like just something that he read, just like that came across his computer or that he just saw on the internet.
It feels really shady.
I certainly can understand the frustration of people, but my main role in the task force was to make recommendations to protect the health and the safety of the American people.
For me, it seems his entire management was not about serving the sick and dying. It was about serving and protecting the system that was responsible for the sick and dying.
And I would hope that people understand that that's the reason why we're doing what we're doing, and hopefully we'll put an end to this.
So Fauci still hasn't gotten back to me, right, at this point. And so I wrote him again, and I write him, hello, just bring this email back to the top of your inbox. As new facts emerge, I'm left with many questions. I'm hoping to connect at your convenience. Thank you, Dr. Fauci. And I get an email back from him tonight, and it says, Jenner, thanks for this note. Your proposal sounds interesting. However, I am totally immersed in the rollout of my memoir.
Wow.
On call. So I got a copy of the manuscript and the audio file for the book, and Fauci reads the book.
Part 1, from Bensonhurst to Washington.
It's crazy.
Brooklyn boy.
Yeah.
Anthony Stephen Fauci was born at Brooklyn Hospital.
And so I've just been going through the book.
The ultimate game changer.
And I have it playing in my car.
It's like stepping into an alternative universe.
Had what they referred to as instinctively good clinical judgment.
You know, it's this curated experience of Dr. Fauci with his Brooklyn accent.
If you want me to like soft-shell crabs, I like soft-shell crabs.
This is just nuts. And so I went to the COVID chapter, and he is bouncing around so much, it's really hard to follow.
Part 5, COVID.
I mean, he starts some point late in January.
The Situation Room on January 29th, 2020.
And the first scene's an interaction with Trump.
Anthony, he said, you are really a famous guy.
He barely mentions Bob Redfield at all.
Bob reported that Gao assured him the situation was under control.
Definitely doesn't mention that they were arguing about the origin
I had
of the
the
virus.
sense that something large and frightening was
And
on
I
the
can't
horizon.
find any mention of the fern cleavage site.
We had been considering the next step for a few days.
He doesn't say anything about these panicked emails and trying to get in touch with everybody for a secret teleconference. No mention whatsoever of how they didn't invite Bob Redfield.
The upshot, I became the de facto public face of the country's battle with the disease.
It's hard to look at this and not see a pattern. And the pattern is this completely curated version of history.
Calm the country's anxieties and provide factual information.
People should not be walking around with masks.
A lot of this wasn't even factually true, and the way he's describing this to the public and in his book is exaggerated at best.
Bats, as they evolve.
If not, it was legitimately misinformation.
Totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
How do you listen to anything this guy says and think it's true?
If Fauci did have a hand in covering all this up, why would he do it in the first place? What is he really protecting here?
All of this stuff with Fauci, I believe, is set in place to protect the interests of the people who rule the people. People so high up on the ladder that we don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
When you look at abuses of government power, information takes such a long time to come out.
The Tuskegee experiment was a US-backed program.
For 40 years, the CDC let black men suffer with syphilis without giving them proper care. Some people think they even injected the men with syphilis.
Really interesting example that I found in the middle of the pandemic.
Whether ticks were ever weaponized.
Congress decided to investigate the origin of Lyme disease.
Oh, God.
Wow.
Lyme disease. Kwame Holman has
1975 was the first outbreak of Lyme disease. You have the outbreak of a disease that is an augmented strain of Rocky Mountain fever, which up until 1975 only existed in Colorado. This illness is breaking out on the completely other side of the country, in Lyme, Connecticut. Lyme is just miles away from this Plum Island Animal Disease Center, which apparently was a hotspot for bioweapons research.
The researcher who was credited with discovering Lyme disease was a bioweapons specialist.
Ironically, Congress started an investigation in the middle of the COVID pandemic, decades later.
A lot of this is about biodefense, which is a story way bigger than COVID and one that started a long time ago.
Vice President Dick Cheney became convinced that the United States needs to pursue a more aggressive program of biodefense research.
We're in the middle of improving our capability to do that.
Dick Cheney is part of the Project for a New American Century.
This was a manifesto about how America was going to grow its empire in the 21st century. They talked about energy dominance, they talk about military power, and they say that all of this could be possible
if there was an attack on American soil. Everything that happens after 9/11 is directly connected to this story.
Anthrax.
Rare inhaled form of anthrax.
9/11 created the war on terror, and the anthrax attack created the war on bioterror. And Dick Cheney used this to completely deregulate biodefense and get it out of the Pentagon.
He found one department and one official who agreed. The official was Dr. Fauci.
This gave Anthony Fauci billions of dollars to fund the riskiest research in the world with no oversight. And this anthrax attack made Anthony Fauci the most powerful man in science.
Oversee the development of countermeasures for anthrax.
And as I listened, I didn't hear him mention anything about how that whole thing was an inside job.
The suspect committed suicide before he could be arrested.
The individual responsible was Bruce Ivins, a researcher before Dietrich campus in Maryland.
Fauci becomes the head of biodefense because of a hoax committed by a biodefense researcher who allegedly commits suicide.
Think about that.
That's fucking crazy.
Think about that.
But this was never acknowledged, and he just got the billions anyway. And the hoax and all these billions of dollars go into this crazy genetic research that's extremely dangerous.
We're investigating new programs with powerful new tools.
Fauci gets dragged into all this controversy around the genetic reconstruction of the Spanish flu. This is the one that caused the 1918 pandemic. People were like, what the fuck are you doing? This virus killed hundreds of millions of people around the world and has been dormant for 100 years. Why would we want to bring it back to life?
God.
Whether that was your intention or not, you've created a bioweapon.
There were U.S. policies in place that were put in place to protect the public from laboratory-generated pandemics, and those policies were violated repeatedly and flagrantly.
This issue has provoked a lot of anger in everybody.
Scientists like Bryce Nichols and Justin Kinney are part of a movement for biosafety and are big critics of Fauci.
Fauci's legacy is tied to this type of dangerous research activity.
Doctors would have a responsibility to do no harm. But Anthony Fauci was putting the life of everyone on the planet at risk without their consent.
Researchers took bird flu and manipulated it to make it easier to transmit between humans.
Fauci was drawn into a scandal with a scientist named Ron Fauci, who used gain of function to make bird flu airborne in mammals. This had never been done before.
We already did everything we can to protect the virus from getting out of our facilities, and well, I will leave it with that for now.
You have said to me in a phone interview that this was, quote, the doomsday virus.
There was an accident and could have infected humans.
I think that what we need to make sure is that we don't mix apples and oranges.
People have mixed opinions, but if it had leaked, the virus could have killed like 20 to 50% of the world's population.
People playing God, man. People with God complexes.
But instead of being punished for doing this work and putting the entire world's population at risk by doing this work, they were celebrated.
Fauci didn't apologize. Fauci celebrated it, and he actually wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying that this was a flu risk worth taking.
Yes, gain-of-function research could trigger a pandemic, but it is so important for public health and national security, it would be a mistake not to do it.
I personally think it's a miracle that that hasn't already been used as a bioterrorist event.
Mike?
Yeah, and let me just follow up. You know, any SARS, any number of viruses, it would be a horrible tragedy if they ever were to leak out, but we could contain them and it would not see a global pandemic.
Wait, what? SARS could get out and cause a pandemic and it wouldn't hurt the world?
It would be a horrible tragedy if they ever were to leak out, but we could contain them and it would not see a global pandemic.
Wow.
So I think that...
Look at this shit. Look at Fauci. Look at his face.
1977 H1N1 was an accidental release, no doubt about it.
They knew this could happen, man, and they knew it had happened before.
It's all so crazy.
We don't want to see that happen again with a virus like this. What we're trying to do is come to the middle. How to do this research safely, how to do it in a way that further...
He knew this could happen, and it seems like it's happened a lot of times before.
epidemics of disease and fear.
In 2014, there was an Ebola outbreak in West Africa.
In Kenema, the outbreak is out of control. For medical workers,
the facts didn't add up.
Fluids could be a death
The strain of Ebola that caused the outbreak in 2014 had never been seen in West Africa before. It's found in Zaire, which is 2,000 miles away.
In 2014, a journalist named Sam Husseini had a lot of questions about this outbreak.
He traced it back to a boy in Miliandu, little Emile, but the boy's father doesn't think that he died of Ebola. The healthcare workers don't think that he died of Ebola.
A lab in Sierra Leone was suspected of being the potential source of this outbreak of Ebola.
The head of Doctors Without Borders, when she got there, she was like, I'm not setting foot in that lab. They were so appalled by the conditions.
And now, here's where the story takes a whole other twist. That lab had a lot of connections to Christian Anderson and Bob Gary. These scientists got money to do Ebola research from Fauci and Collins, and from Jeremy Farrar, and now they may be tied to a whole other cover-up.
When that outbreak happened, you had people like Peter Daszak claim that it came from bats.
There's been more and more evidence that bats are the source of Ebola virus.
Somehow, bats were the culprit that spread Ebola Zaire across a 2,000-mile journey. And there's a very disturbing pattern here.
And that pattern of deception became more obvious to people in the medical community like Dr. Marty Makary.
I had become skeptical of Dr. Fauci during the Ebola epidemic. Dr. Fauci transferred a nurse in Dallas with Ebola to the NIH Clinical Center in Washington, D.C. And then Dr. Fauci puts on an astronaut suit and walks in with a photographer and gets a photo opportunity. That's when I took a step back and thought, yes, Dr. Fauci is a nice guy, but that whole Ebola incident seemed like a circus.
After the Ebola outbreak in 2014, there was a ban on gain-of-function research. But many people think that that ban was violated and that they did even more gain-of-function research at Wuhan. David Asher was at the State Department during the pandemic. When he began investigating the origin, he found all these crazy connections between the NIH and the Wuhan lab.
In 2015, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has launched a global recruitment plan of principal investigators under the Outstanding Foreign Talents Program, quote unquote, of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And the NIH is actually helping match scientists to the Chinese program to recruit our most sensitive biologists.
This was going to be China's first BSL-4 laboratory, which is the highest level of security.
Those are the ones where everybody has the full suit and the respirator.
The Chinese had partnered with the French to build this lab and then kicked them out the day it was finished.
Their view is a sign that there was a biological, military-related research program that had adversarial ambitions.
And this could have been a reason for the US to start spying on the Wuhan lab.
Peter Daszak was very deep into this world of emerging infectious diseases and potential biological weapons or dual-use research.
A lot of people believe that Peter Daszak may have been using all of these research projects to spy on the Wuhan lab.
We started to look into it, and what we found was very alarming.
There's a whistleblower inside Daszak's company named Andrew Huff who says he witnessed Daszak talk about spying on the Chinese.
Dr. Peter Daszak and I are closing up the office, and as he locks the door, he turns to me and says, Andrew, do you mind if I ask you a question? Sure, Peter, go ahead. Well, Andrew, someone from the CIA approached me, and they're interested in the places we're working, the people we're working with, and the data we're collecting. Do you think it's a good idea that we work with them? And I'm shocked. I mean, I couldn't believe that my boss, Dr. Peter Daszak, is asking me whether or not we should work with the CIA. In hindsight, I suspect that he had been working with the intelligence community for a long time. How far back, I don't know.
The research that Dashik was doing at Wuhan was already incredibly dangerous.
This was singled out as the research project on the planet with the highest likelihood of causing a pandemic.
Why on earth would the US fund this crazy research?
The answer for me is simple. We traded the Chinese the most advanced biotechnology in the world for access to their laboratory so we could collect intelligence on it. I decided that I had to get out of the organization as fast as I could.
And around this time, they end up lifting the ban on gain of function to do even more dangerous research.
I don't think this is going to be foolproof. Things are going to slip through.
It makes you question the motives of some of these people.
Assisting the design of the Wuhan Institute of Virology was Dr. Stefan Bancel. Bancel is now the CEO of Moderna.
Stefan Bancel and the NIH had a close relationship with this lab. Moderna was researching a coronavirus vaccine to launch their mRNA platform, and they were using research that was happening at Wuhan.
My colleagues in China did the work. You create pseudoparticles, you insert the spike proteins from those viruses, sifted bind to human cells.
I mean, we gotta let this sink in. The US was potentially spying on the Wuhan lab. And Moderna may have been researching the mRNA vaccine at Wuhan before the pandemic even happened. The question is, when did the pandemic actually start? It was reported in December 2019, but there's intelligence that says it happened 3 months earlier and was covered up.
Sometime in September, something happened in the Wuhan lab.
There were workers falling sick at the Wuhan Institute, and they seem to be the first people in China that we knew of to fall sick.
Not only were we lied to about where the pandemic may have come from, we were lied to about when it started. And the US had intelligence about this. There's all these different signals, and there's even satellite photos of overcrowded hospitals. And then the World Military Games happens in October. Teams from around the world compete in Wuhan. Some of them get sick, and countries with the most teams at the event are the first places to have massive outbreaks. France, Italy, Iran, the US. This was the first super spreader. And then in December, before the pandemic's reported, there's this agreement between Moderna, the NIH, and Ralph Barrick's lab to share information about an mRNA vaccine, which they claim is a coincidence. But the actual deal for the vaccine happened only 2 weeks after the pandemic was reported, and this was like a $50 billion deal.
Moderna shares are trading higher following.
And then Fauci and a group of scientists with critical conflicts of interest directly connected to gain of function, to Wuhan, to spying on China, and to other potential leaks like Ebola, secretly convene, and the scientists in that meeting published 33 science papers and letters saying that there was, quote, no evidence of a lab leak, that it was a conspiracy theory, and that it came from this wet market.
It's interesting because it has jumped species likely from an animal source.
It's beyond suspicious. It's scientific malpractice on a global scale.
More cities and states have started shutdowns. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut.
America is completely unprepared for a pandemic.
Because it is evil.
Even though Fauci claimed his sole purpose for doing this dangerous research was to prepare for a pandemic.
Bring in Dr. Anthony Fauci.
And Fauci jumps in front of the cameras to become the spokesperson for a pandemic he may have had a hand in creating.
I mean, he was doing media interviews from 6 a.m. in the morning till 12 midnight.
People should not be walking around with masks. Right now, people.
But the problem is, all that messaging was wrong.
Whether schools should be closed or open.
The schools should be closed.
The right answer for many of the big questions during the COVID pandemic was, we don't know. But instead, they made it up.
How could we ever look at this story the same way again? How could we ever look at this man the same way again? How could we ever see him as a hero ever again?
There's a new social media challenge.
And why did the American media decide not to cover any of this?
Because it's the safe thing to do.
This was the same media that had driven the country apart, and by the time we got to the pandemic, we were so fucked, all we had was the news replaying clips of Sarah Silverman singing to herself. But not all people on the left fell for this, and there were journalists like Christian Parenti who could see this more clearly.
If you've got the intelligence services, you've got the scientific establishment, you've got the pharmaceutical companies, you've got the political parties. Like the gauntlet had been thrown down. Both sides in our political system, the Republicans and the Democrats, had staked out their positions.
Kung flu.
Trump misreads it.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute.
Most incompetent and uninformed.
And the Democrats are thinking, this time we finally got him. He's misunderstanding this virus.
He takes no responsibility. He still doesn't have a plan.
So they go all in on ratcheting up fear.
I feel like I'm gonna have to rewire myself.
You know what I'd like to do?
All of a sudden, Fauci became a hero to everyone who hated Trump.
That faceplant transformed him into a progressive idol who soon had bobblehead dolls and votive candles and an audience of people who imagined he was all that stood between them and Donald Trump. He leaned into the celebrity. That is why he was shielded.
He became a patron saint of science just because it was politically convenient.
I want to say thank you, Dr. Fauci, for your perseverance in leading us all through this pandemic.
Here's to you, Anthony Fauci.
I almost feel bad for these people. It's like they got played.
Thank you for your invaluable public service.
Can I have your autograph?
Just feels like a Black Mirror episode.
Dr. Fauci, you are my hero.
It's insane.
I thank you for fighting the good fight.
Thank you for being kind.
Tony, we love you. We honor you. We thank God for you.
Dr. Fauci, I want to thank you for always telling the truth, even during the hardest moments.
Despite the fact there was all this evidence that connected him to the birth of this pandemic in the first place, people were thanking him for his service.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
This became such a perverse, politically driven story.
Congratulations!
Frontline workers were thanking him even though he may have put their lives at risk.
Congratulations on being named the Federal Employee of the Year.
Yeah, it's disgusting. So it's disgusting.
And so you get this layering of independent interests that come together to just push hysteria and fear and support for censorship and support for authoritarian control.
And a lot of these COVID policies enraged the country and led us to the brink of civil war.
Attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science.
Fauci just manipulated people and said that they were anti-science if they disagreed with him. Specifically about the vaccine mandates.
Mandating vaccines.
And I actually encourage it.
I mean, this tore us apart.
It was generally believed the reason the COVID pandemic was continuing was the unvaccinated, and the unvaccinated was a term for conservative Republicans, often in rural areas, who were uneducated.
Oh, you can't shame them. You can't call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are.
But the reality was the biggest group of unvaccinated Americans by percentage was African Americans, because they distrusted public health for good reasons. You go back to the barbaric experiments that our medical establishment did to that community.
So when you see Nicki Minaj, Lakeith, Kanye reluctant to take the vaccination, they're all made to look crazy.
A fan had shot this video of Busta Rhymes.
All these little weird-ass government policies and mandates suck a dick.
He was criticized, but his rage was justified.
I'm trying to take our civil liberties away.
Take Kyrie Irving, all the damage done for not taking the vaccination. Fortunately for Kyrie Irving, he's a multimillionaire several times over. But I know some teachers, or I know some firemen, I know a lot of people had to resign.
Average Americans were enraged, so it's not a surprise to see Fauci on 60 Minutes having to go for a walk with bodyguards.
Dr. Fauci now power walks, flanked by federal agents.
Critically minded journalists went along with BS and didn't question things that they knew they should have questioned.
No one was questioning Fauci or Peter Daszak. People just fell for it. Even renowned economist Jeffrey Sachs fell for Peter Daszak. Sachs and Peter Daszak were working on this commission for The Lancet, which was the same journal that published his conspiracy theory letter. And it wasn't until Ebright sent Sachs all of these research grants with Daszak, Wuhan, Ralph Baric, that Sachs finally confronted Daszak.
The next day, I contacted Daszak and I said I'd like to see the whole thing. Daszak's response to me was, I can't give that to you. My lawyers say I can't give that to you. I said, Peter, what are you saying? No, my lawyer said I can't give that to you.
There's a consistent line of evidence and a consistent line of obfuscation, which is usually when guilty parties are trying to engage in a cover-up. And, you don't have to be Woodward and Bernstein to figure this shit out in Washington. Looked to me like it had a lot to do with Tony Fauci cutting big checks and perhaps elements of the intelligence community encouraging individuals not to be so forthcoming either. We don't really know.
The State Department just dropping what it calls previously undisclosed.
After the State Department report comes out, the WHO sends a group to Wuhan to investigate. And what is absolutely crazy is Peter Daszak was leading the WHO mission to Wuhan. Apparently, China refused to approve most of the scientists that were presented, but for some reason, they approved Peter Daszak.
Here was my former boss conducting gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which could have been the place where this disease originated, now investigating the origin of the disease. I couldn't believe it.
You look at these images of Daszak at the Wuhan lab, it's all so brazen, and it just makes you question everything.
I came to understand that some conspiracy theories are wrong. Many are right, actually.
Did you find anything inside?
And after the Wuhan trip, there's the first release of these emails through the Freedom of Information Act. But they're all like redacted. And so why are they redacted if Fauci and the NIH have nothing to hide?
You've had the distinct honor and pleasure of having many of your emails released to the public over the last few days.
And Fauci goes on this media tour.
They only took about 10,000 emails from me. Of course, I remember. I remember all 10,000 of them. Give me a break.
And they did, with a lot of the outlets taking his word for it.
Those 3,200 pages of emails don't appear to contain anything particularly explosive.
It's preposterous, Chuck. Totally preposterous.
We've struggled to understand why there's controversy around it.
Chuck Todd even says there's really nothing here, and yet he doesn't ask him what was in all of the redacted emails. He could release all this stuff with no scrutiny, and it just goes to show how powerful he was.
He's been there for 50 years, so he's like J. Edgar Hoover, and the only way that you last 50 years is by carrying water for the pharmaceutical industry.
Robert Kennedy Jr. had written 2 whole books about Anthony Fauci, and one of RFK's biggest talking points was the censorship. You couldn't find information because people were being erased off the internet. Adam Andrzejewski had started this organization called Open the Books. He had done forensic accounting on government, and he was a very well-respected columnist at Forbes. That was until he started writing bad stuff about Fauci.
So in 2021, we noticed that Dr. Anthony Fauci was the most highly compensated federal employee.
He was a public servant making close to $500,000.
His net worth went up by $5 million during the pandemic years. 2019, it was $7 million. By 2022, his net worth was more than $12 million.
He's also gotten a copy of Anthony Fauci's calendar.
We launched this finding in my column at Forbes. I received a phone call from my regular editor. I was barred from writing about Anthony Fauci any longer. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with NIH for all the email correspondence, and what we found was, at the height of the pandemic, when Omicron was sweeping the country, these 6 powerful executives at NIH and Dr. Fauci himself, throughout the night, crafted the pushback email to Forbes. And so, rather than back my reporting, they decided to fold the column. After 8 years, 206 columns, 20 million page views, I'd been promoted to senior policy contributor at Forbes. They went silent on me, and after 10 days, I was terminated. On the day I was terminated, Forbes bent the knee to Dr. Anthony Fauci, and they penned a column that Fauci's portrait will hang in the Smithsonian Institute.
And of his many critics, the one who he couldn't get fired was Senator Rand Paul.
Government scientists like yourself who favor gain-of-function research.
I don't favor gain-of-function research in China. You are saying things that are not correct.
That was joint research between the Wuhan Institute and Dr. Barrick. You can't deny it.
And right after this hearing in May 2021, all these different emails and documents, they kept dropping in these Freedom of Information cases.
The weight of the evidence was this was a lab release.
And after all these new emails drop, he goes back in front of Rand Paul, who basically says, you perjured yourself.
Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement.
Gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
That is
Can't
not...
get away from it. It meets your definition, and you are obfuscating the truth.
And you are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individuals. I totally resent that. And if anybody is lying here, Senator, it is you.
And while Rand Paul is grilling him during the summer of 2021, a huge development is about to happen.
In the summer of 2021, Major Joseph Murphy reached out to me and told me of the existence of what we now know as the diffuse proposal.
Joseph Murphy is in a wing of the DoD called DARPA. He's found this proposal called diffuse. Diffuse is written by Peter Daszak, and this is a proposal to create a virus that looks exactly like the virus that caused the pandemic 1 year before the pandemic emerged.
Wow.
In diffuse, scientists propose collecting samples from wild bat populations in Yunnan province, China, in order to engineer new pathogens.
To look for the next SARS.
Then they're going to bring them back into the lab. They're going to insert the furin cleavage site, literally. That's their intent, is to insert it.
Specifically to make the resulting virus more dangerous to humans.
They say they're going to do a lot of work at Ralph Barrick's lab, but right on the masthead of the proposal is the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Story is that it was submitted to DARPA, which is part of the Defense Department, and the story is that the proposal was not funded and that the work was never done. 9 times out of 10, when you submit a grant proposal, you already have about 50% of the work done. So it seems surprising that nobody wanted to tell us about this.
Diffuse is so explosive and reveals so many different things that they had to have a natural origin. And the public could never find out, because once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it again.
Diffuse was the biggest break in the story thus far, over 4 years.
Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Murphy risked potentially going to prison for the rest of his life to leak the diffuse proposal to me. And as a father myself, I know that he risked his freedom and his ability to be a father, and he did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's been an inspiration to me, because I believe that he has done more than any single person to shed truth on the origin of this pandemic.
Hi, this is Emily Kopp. I'm a reporter with US Right to Know.
And after Diffuse, Emily goes on to do some of the most comprehensive reporting about all the behind-the-scenes emails and Slack messages and secret teleconferences. A few other journalists were treating Diffuse like it was a major breakthrough.
The Intercept covered the story quite carefully, and they particularly covered the diffuse proposal.
But I'm confused. Where's the New York Times on this? Like, where's the Washington Post? And when accomplished scientists like Alina Chan picked up the reporting and wrote a book like Viral, she did an interview saying she was harassed.
People called me a race traitor.
And when the Great Barrington Declaration questioned lockdowns, scientists like Jay Bhattacharya were alienated from the science community.
Fauci created an illusion of consensus.
Scientists were being censored on social media. And when Elon Musk was taking over Twitter, he released the Twitter files, which confirmed that Fauci and the Biden administration were censoring users. Fauci ended up getting sued by 2 states for stuff related to this. And he does this deposition that's, you know, laughable.
I don't recall. I don't recall. I don't recall. I might have. I don't recall.
He gives the same answer over and over again.
I don't recall. I do not recall. I don't really recall.
This entire system of power that Fauci built over 50 years was crumbling in his hands.
We have breaking news from the White House. Dr. Anthony Fauci is retiring.
He is stepping down in December after more than 5 decades of public service.
Literally like a month later, the Department of Energy and the FBI both released declassified reports saying that the virus most likely was engineered in a lab.
He conveniently ducks out. He retires to try and avoid being held accountable.
The House of Representatives decides to investigate, but it's all politically charged.
Democrats that sit on this committee, they only hindered.
Which is kind of compromised from the start.
Republicans spent on advancing this partisan narrative.
And so Redfield is like the opening testimony.
You have said before that you were locked out of conversations about the lab leak by Dr. Fauci. And do you think they kept you out of the conversations because you believe COVID-19 may have come from a lab?
Yeah, I think I made it very clear in January to all of them.
I was told that the reason I wasn't included, they were going to come out with a single point of view that everyone had to agree with, and that it was clear that I wasn't going to be capable of that.
Why's that?
Unfortunately, I have this bad trait that I can't get rid of. I'm honest.
And then the committee questioned people that weren't so honest, like Christian Anderson and Bob Gary.
Did either of you have any conversations with Peter Daszak while drafting Proxima Origin?
We did not. No one follows up with any tough questions and asks them, hey, that's interesting. We have it here that you were on a conference call with Peter Daszak and Ralph Barrick on February 3rd.
Dr. Gary, did you have any conversations with Dr. Daszak?
I did not. Anderson and Gary perjured themselves before Congress. Those are felonies.
You know, you watch this hearing and no one's putting the pieces together.
No one is understanding what all these scientists have in common.
I think fundamental biology research, which includes gain-of-function research, is important.
It was so important that people did everything they could to cover it up.
New allegations this morning from an unnamed CIA whistleblower relating to the origins of COVID-19.
All of a sudden, there's this whistleblower from the CIA that comes forward.
A senior-level officer claiming the agency offered hush money to analysts to cover up their findings.
There were reports that Fauci had been in the CIA building, and it wasn't just Moderna with a conflict of interest. Apparently, Scott Gottlieb from Pfizer was also in the CIA building. What are Fauci and Pfizer doing in the CIA building? And a couple months later, Ralph Barrick agrees to do a closed-door testimony, and in the middle of the testimony, he's asked if he's a spy.
There's a question where you would source the IC, and suddenly it goes off the record. And I mean, Ralph Barrick, he basically admits that he was an intelligence source. It's all blacked out, but he's obviously talking with somebody. Them being used as intelligence sources, okay, given the fact that they all work for the Chinese and are compensated by the Chinese, I find crazy.
The weakest link here is Peter Daszak.
Draft of the diffuse proposal was released via FOIA.
DARPA turned us down for whatever reasons DARPA had. And I want to remind the committee that this proposal was never funded and the work was never done.
But not a lot of people are taking Peter Daszak's word for it. And Rixey had done a deeper analysis of the diffuse proposal.
It wasn't until the diffuse proposal mentioned DC sign that I realized how important it was.
DC sign is about targeting D cells. D cells are immune system cells. This proposal wanted to create a virus that would confuse your immune system. And it would allow the virus to go undetected until it infected your immune system. So if they engineered it to have DC sign, what other viruses would they find this feature in?
The conspiracies that we were talking about in February 2020 were things like there are HIV inserts into the virus.
Looking back, it seems obvious.
The conspiracies that we were talking about were things like there are HIV inserts into the virus.
The HIV virus does this to people. So looking back, these HIV inserts that were part of the paper written by these Indian scientists on January 31st, they make a lot of sense now.
There were 4 unique inserts in total, and one of those inserts contained the furin cleavage site, and the other 3 contained elements from different HIV strains. And those 3 inserts allow this virus to utilize DC sign.
There is this insane probability that all of these things would happen naturally. So if you look at this paper that these Indian scientists put out, and the timeline, it's January 31st when everybody panics, right? Christian Anderson even says that he got a panic call from Fauci about the HIV inserts. And after all those teleconferences, this paper written by Pradhan et al., it was pulled down by February 3rd.
The conspiracies that we were talking about were things like there are HIV inserts into the virus.
The fuse is connecting all of these pieces. I mean, it makes sense why they would want to cover it up. It's just very damning. It's not a good look.
I found the grant to Amy Sims in the Barrick lab to use coronavirus to make HIV vaccines. So this isn't related to Diffuse, but the people on Diffuse included Amy Sims. When I looked at this grant, the alarm bells went off, ding, ding, ding. Finding a grant where they do put HIV bits into coronavirus, it's kind of eerie, yeah?
Scientists were concerned about testing a live attenuated HIV vaccine.
You know, there's a lot of this vaccine research that Fauci and other people don't want us to know about.
Vaccines, if not properly and completely inactivated, could lead to a public health disaster.
Vaccine research trying to end one pandemic could accidentally cause another one. And I found this article called SWAT Teams and Copycat Cover-Ups by Ed Hooper. Hooper had been featured in this documentary called The Origin of AIDS. Just like the wet market theory for COVID, scientists blamed HIV on Africans eating monkeys. This was called the bushmeat theory. But if you watch Hooper in this documentary, he has a completely different theory about the origin.
AIDS came about as an act of man, not as an act of God.
None of this surprises me at all, man. The more you dig, the more you find out, the less faith you have.
In the late 50s, scientists were in the Congo testing polio vaccines on Africans.
You know, polio was a horrible, debilitating disease.
Yeah.
These scientists that were doing these polio vaccine trials believed, probably in their heart of hearts, that they were doing this for humanity. And sometimes when you have that belief, you can cut corners.
You can always think you're doing good, but that don't mean you are.
Scientist named Hilary Kaprowski cultured the polio vaccine in the kidney cells of chimpanzees.
So while they were doing these trials, there were other viruses that ended up crossing over into humans from these chimpanzees. But even though there was this huge risk, they end up rushing these vaccine trials with Africans, no white people, without disclosing any of the risks.
It's just devilish.
For 2 years, these scientists administer millions of doses in Kinshasa. And by the end of the study in 1959, in the same city, is the first major outbreak of HIV.
It's evil.
Federal health officials say as many as 1 million Americans may have been infected with the AIDS virus.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague.
Even without any connections to the polio vaccine and the origin of AIDS, people were enraged at Reagan and Fauci for how they were handling the pandemic. Activists like Michael Petrellis even stormed the NIH.
Anthony Fauci, I piss on you.
I promise you we'll give you the data. I do think there is still a conspiracy.
You are a politician.
Fauci was hated by almost all people suffering with HIV. He was arrogant and condescending.
I think that you may be naive in understanding how you can get things done in Washington.
Fauci was already under fire for failed treatments like AZT.
Abandoned cancer chemotherapy treatments that were taken off the shelf.
Then in the late 90s, the story comes out in Rolling Stone about the oral polio vaccine and connections to the origin of the pandemic.
Why and how?
There were several mysteries that
Fauci was already on the rocks with the black community.
To tell us what to do, how to treat our bodies, and how to live a more...
Around this time, he was working on an AIDS vaccine, and a story about a vaccine tested on black people accidentally causing a pandemic that was ravaging the black community was not good PR for him or for science. Over the next couple years, a series of papers come out debunking the polio theory. Fauci promotes some of that work, saying that the theory was dead. The crazy coincidence is some of those papers were written by Bob Gary, Andrew Rambo, and Eddie Holmes. The same guy's given a big ask right before the pandemic broke out. Anyone seeing a pattern here? It's all the same people. And they apparently have written the same type of papers for the last 20 years.
Totally consistent.
After all, viruses only come from nature. The story Fauci loves to tell.
I don't recall. I might have.
And I feel like I still don't even know the whole story. What other shit are these people covering up?
I promise you we'll give you the data.
Makes sense why they needed to get an honest guy like Redfield out of the room. This doesn't seem like the place for honesty.
I think that you may be naive in understanding how you can get things done in Washington.
And when it came to getting things done in Washington, Tony Fauci was masterful. He always knew how to get his way, and he always knew how to cover his tracks. So after decades of being called in front of Congress, there was no big surprises.
The accusation being circulated that I tried to cover up the possibility that the virus originated from a lab. In fact, the truth is exactly the opposite.
Was CDC Director Redfield on that call?
Some tough questions.
Redfield's lying to the committee when you sat right where you sat? Really?
Really?
Wow.
There were some fireworks,
Mr. Fauci.
some unhinged emotions.
Dr. Fauci, did you ever treat a patient for COVID during the pandemic?
We didn't take care of many of them.
Okay, so not hands-on. Got it.
Some very powerful moments.
Why would I be criticized by a bureaucrat who's never treated a patient for COVID? You can read all the things you want, but you're not there. You're not seeing patients. You're not watching people die, intubating patients right there.
My mom was a healthcare worker during the pandemic. My mom died of COVID. My stepfather died of COVID. I lost both of my parents.
But nothing really changed in this story.
My opinion is that you are an American hero.
And what we have found is the following. Dr. Fauci did not fund research that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Fauci did not lie about gain-of-function research. And Dr. Fauci did not orchestrate a campaign to suppress the lab leak theory.
He did not lie to Congress.
Unsubstantiated. Unsubstantiated.
This is crazy.
It's the most unfair thing I have seen.
No evidence.
No evidence.
What?
The evidence to date points to COVID-19 having originated from an animal market in China.
What planet are these people on? I mean, this whole thing is a joke.
He should be tried for mass murder, and he should be tried for...
Our system is like professional wrestling.
After that hearing, that's how the American people feel.
Dr. Fauci has had an honorable career as he and his colleagues helped us save millions of lives.
Does there need to be accountability for Dr. Fauci?
This hearing demonstrated that he's being held accountable, but they have no evidence he did anything wrong.
Congressman, I'm just concerned that there is evidence and that it's being overlooked. There's evidence of research that has been happening for almost 20 years that is very dangerous to humanity. If we saved 2 million people with a vaccine, but we lost 20 million people, this is a bad thing for humanity. I'm very concerned.
Well, send me
I
that
have a lot that I
like
could
Dr.
send.
Fauci said, he has an open mind on it, and I think
He didn't,
we all
though.
should have an open mind.
You cited the CDC director. The CDC director was locked out of conversation starting on January 31st. We're losing the plot, I feel.
We're open to all the
I hope you
evidence.
are. I hope you are.
It's so disturbing.
It's really disturbing. This whole process has been demoralizing. But right around the time of the hearing, Adam Andrzejewski had gotten all this new data about the royalties that the NIH received from Big Pharma during the pandemic.
$690 million worth of third-party royalties. Those are payments from pharmaceutical companies back to Fauci's institute. It calls into question whether these decisions were made in the special interest of Anthony Fauci and his institute. It's an open question. It's not answered yet, but the truth will come out.
A few weeks after this interview, before Adam even got a chance to release that information, Adam inexplicably died in his sleep.
The cause of death is unknown. Hope, for his family's sake, they get the answers.
Right. But totally healthy man, marathon runner.
and he's reporting on the royalty payments from pharmaceutical companies and died in his sleep.
We don't know how Adam died, but we do know that these pharmaceutical companies have made a lot of money from this pandemic. After Moderna had taken in close to $50 billion from the vaccines, sales started flattening out.
One of your main revenue drivers is no longer there. You have to find new ways of running the company.
By 2024, Stefan Bunzel was doing a lot of press about the future of Moderna.
But the piece also we should look at is long COVID.
Long COVID is a very complicated condition. It's quite serious.
Currently being treated.
It can present itself in many different ways.
Rixie's had long COVID since 2020.
I was really sick when I got COVID, and ever since then, I've been hit with neurological, cardiological, and immune dysregulation symptoms.
One of the patients I saw today, when she came to see me 2.5, 3 years ago, she came on a stretcher. She had so much autonomic dysfunction from COVID, she couldn't sit up.
There's research suggesting that the furin cleavage site may be toxic to liver and lung cells, and if there are HIV inserts in the virus, it would explain autoimmune problems.
I also have a number of patients that have post-COVID symptoms from the mRNA vaccine.
After I got the vaccine, the symptoms have been exacerbated. My physical health has declined dramatically.
Do you have any concern about the side effect profile?
He's talking about mRNA side effects like myocarditis and blood clots, and they aren't the only side effects.
A lot of negative side effects for...
There's a lot of chatter on the internet right now about these turbo cancers. It's been dismissed as anti-vax, but all these scientists have been going through the genetic information, and they found 19 characters. When you reverse them, they are a 2016 patent from Moderna for MSH3. Apparently a key component in fighting the mutations that cause cancer.
Which is why the cancer has been growing.
And Bunzel certainly isn't talking about that in his interviews. A cancer mutating gene patented by his company that may have been found in the virus.
Could in a few years actually become more
in this potential surge in turbo cancers after the pandemic.
I think the chance we have is we have a platform.
Instead, he's on CNBC talking about how cancer is about to make Moderna a lot of money.
We're going to get the company back into sales growth. We're going to get towards 26 to...
And it's completely horrifying. So I figured I'd write Fauci one last email. I told him what I really care about is all this dangerous research, the stuff he said was a risk worth taking, and this Pandora's box that he's opened up, creating this terrifying dystopian future. So thank you, Dr. Fauci, for that. And I did get a response, but not from him, from his lawyer, who is a heavyweight attorney who has represented like 3 presidents, who basically said that Tony is just too busy with his book, and he's not going to be able to do the interview. So that is that.
Epilogue. I certainly could not anticipate that I would become a political lightning rod.
And I've just been listening to the epilogue of his book.
I became a symbol of the profound divisiveness in our country, a figure who represents hope to so many and evil to some.
He does seem pretty aware about how he changed society, but from the perspective of a man living in an alternate universe, where none of this was problematic and nothing he did was bad. And for some reason, half of the mainstream media in the United States still praises him, which makes 0 sense.
He is our special guest tonight with the new book, On Call. It's good to see you in person.
Same here.
We did that.
This is Fauci's last moment to wallow in the limelight.
Have you thought about running for president? No interest whatsoever.
And egomaniacs like Anthony Fauci really excelled at that.
Fauci, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I mean, it's almost like he's delusional or something.
I don't think he's been gifted with looking in the mirror and seeing what's actually there right now. I think he's convinced himself that he's kind of above it all.
Well, remember this day.
I rewatched Oppenheimer the other day as he was struggling with the reality of what he created. a weapon that could destroy the world.
With viruses, it's like that on steroids. This research may have killed 200 times as many people as Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
There's a whole lot of nothing going on in Washington, D.C., you know, and I don't think that that's acceptable.
It's just a slap in the face to everyone who lost a loved one or lost a business or lost a milestone in their life to this pandemic.
People died in every country, of every age, and whether it was from the virus or the ridiculously insane responses to the virus, most of it was wrong. And that's what matters.
We know now that governments lie. And the reason that they lie is because they want to cover up government screw-ups.
Just handed the Chinese this technology for access to their laboratory, which was probably the greatest failure in military history. I think the only way forward is a military tribunal to hold the long list of bad actors accountable.
Those individuals likely caused a pandemic that killed 20 million people and cost $25 trillion.
I think Anthony Fauci should go to jail, honestly. But, you know, that alone won't do anything if we continue to allow this kind of biodefense research.
We have a right to make mistakes, but where I get upset is if we don't acknowledge our mistakes so we don't make the same mistake next time.
Fauci knew and lied repeatedly.
I gave it 110% every day.
Fauci's legacy is bullshit.
Making pathogens more deadly is an existential threat to humanity, and it should be stopped. That's not happening.
There have been no new safety regulations and no new laws implemented. Nothing.
They're actually building up more labs now.
Dr. Fauci claims that they're creating more dangerous viruses in the lab to predict a pandemic or to prevent one. It's never happened. It's a fantasy.
Biodefense may be the greatest euphemism ever for biowarfare.
The truth needs to be told.
It's not just that COVID came from a lab, because we might not ever definitively know that. It's about what people don't want you to find out along the way.
That we are often pawns in a war that we know nothing about.
There are research projects that could kill half the planet if there was an accident. One that only killed a tiny fraction of the population, collapsed global economies, destabilizing the population to the brink of civil war, shut down schools, locked down homes, forced everyone onto new technologies where their data is being monitored, controlled the media, censored scientists and doctors, mandated gene-altering drugs into our bloodstream despite the damage they could cause, while trillions of dollars moved from the poor to the rich in the largest transfer of wealth in modern history. And if that much power and that much wealth and that much social control can be generated by one minor pandemic, this is only the beginning.
The great pandemic is coming. Going to be a bird flu pandemic.
New concerns this morning over bird flu.
For bird flu in Michigan.
Bird flu virus. Jeez, it spreads.
It's going to be a major pandemic. That's coming.
I'm kind of freaked out about this, man.
Oh, the bird flu thing? Take a deep breath. If it was from a lab, you know, we'd already be dead by now.